All right, chapter 3, Daniel chapter 3. You know, David said last week or the week before that the most important chapter in the book of Daniel was chapter 2. Had the dream, talks about, and as a matter of fact, can we go to that second slide, please, Ivan, if you'll put that one up. He had the slide up about the different eras of the dream. And I wouldn't dispute that at all. I do believe it's most important chapter in the book. But if I ask you what is the most familiar chapter in the book, you'd probably say chapter 3 or chapter 6, because chapter 3's got the fiery furnace and chapter 6 has got the story about Daniel in the lion's den. And if you're of an age like me and you live somewhere where you had vacation Bible school and you had it 5 days a week and it was 3 hours a day and all those kind of things back in the Stone Ages when it was a little more involved, how many times have you been through either the story of the fiery furnace or the lion's den? We know those stories and we love those stories. And they fit perfectly with the theme of the book, which is God is sovereign. And so today when we're looking at the third chapter, we'll kind of add to that, God is sovereign and God will protect us because He is God when we do the right thing. And we can take that from chapter 3. I want to think a little bit about chapter 2, though, as we start this morning, because we had the dream. That's what we studied last week. David talked about the fact that Daniel spent 3 years, and the Scripture gives us that he spent up to 3 years in training to be a Babylonian, to be brainwashed to be a Babylonian, to however you want to look at it, to take the Jewish heritage out of him and put the Babylonian heritage in. And then perhaps it was another year and a half or two before that dream event actually took place. Depending on the source, it may be up to 13 years before this fiery furnace incident and the image, the big gold image. I'm not going to get into how long it might have been. I don't think it's all that important, other than just to say, as we look at the interpretation of the dream and we see the personality of a person like Nebuchadnezzar, I kind of want to take that personality back to that dream. How many times when someone's telling you a story and they're looking at plans and those plans involve you, do you focus on the part that's just you and you don't think too much about all the rest of it? When we see Nebuchadnezzar's attitude in chapter 3, I think it kind of comes home the size of his ego. And as we transition from chapter 2 to chapter 3, I kind of think about this dream, and I think about in that image, the head of that image was gold, and it was Babylon. And as he's telling, as Daniel is interpreting this dream to Nebuchadnezzar, I'm picturing a Nebuchadnezzar who's thinking to himself, whoa, that's me. I'm that guy. I'm the gold head. I'm in charge of the world. I'm the most important guy that there is. And we're going to look at a scripture in the middle part of chapter 3 that kind of brings that home to roost. So I kind of wanted to just simply go back to this for a second and think about that dream, and then pull forward, use that to segue into chapter 3 when we get to looking at this golden image and the purpose of the golden image and kind of the attitude of Nebuchadnezzar himself. You know, at the end of chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar praised God, the one true God. When Daniel interpreted that dream, he says, truly, you serve a real God. And so we're thankful when those kind of things happen. And in chapter 3, he does it again. And in chapter 4, he does it again. But in many respects, it appears to be lip service, because regardless of the fact that he praised God, he's not a good guy. And we see other instances of that. But what we draw from that is how God can take anyone and use them in His plan in order to do what God intends to do. And I'm not trying to run down Nebuchadnezzar, I guess, too much. We see a conflicting personality in him. And certainly in chapter 3, we see an ego that's as big as Babylon itself. Let's go to chapter 3, and let's talk about first, the first 7 verses, which is that golden image. We're going to read some of this. I'm not necessarily going to read every single verse, but at least some of it. Phil?
One thing I was going to mention, especially in chapter 2 and chapter 3, when Nebuchadnezzar is talking about God, he's saying, "Your God." It's not like he's internalizing, but rather he thinks of him as the God of the Israelites.
That's a good point. Phil points out that when he does praise God, in chapter 2 especially, he's saying, "Your God." And then the same thing in chapter 3. Your God, the Israelites' God. And he's not saying, "This is also my God." I find some humor in chapter 3 too about the way at the end of this chapter he praises God and the little tag he puts on it and we'll get there by the end. I don't want to give away too much of it before we get to that point. But how he talks about praising God and what he's going to do if somebody talks bad about Daniel or Daniel's God, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. Also, when you learned this story as a kid, raise your hand if you can remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's Hebrew names. Thank you. Because I can't. Because when I learned this story, it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and that's all it's ever been, and that's all I can refer to them by. So I will refer to Daniel by Daniel, his Hebrew name. I will refer to the others by their Babylonian names. Chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar, starting in verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps. That's a great word, by the way, satraps. Isn't it? If Debbie and I ever have any more children, I'm going to name one of them satrap. Satrap Watson has a great ring to it, and we don't find. I love that word, but I guess I should get back to the point. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Skip down to verse 4. Then a herald would cry aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace." It's a big image, right? There is no evidence that the image was made to represent the image that was in the dream. We don't really know what it is or was. When I picture it, I picture just a large obelisk. But it was 75 feet tall, it was 9 feet at the base, and it was meant to be massive because that's the way Nebuchadnezzar thought about things, big. I want to think about what he asked all the government officials to do and what the purpose of it was and how God's going to use this, because all of these people are there at the end too. The same list of government counselors, advisors, satraps, ambassadors, etc., and so on, what all those other words are here now, and they're there at the end, or they're listed as being those that are there when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out of the fiery furnace. But what was the purpose of having them there now? Their job was to go out into the countryside and tell everybody, this is what we got to do. They were going to be there to witness this huge image. And they were going to be the mouthpieces that went back out into the byways and the highways and made sure that everybody understood what you were supposed to do when the tornado siren went off. Okay? Every Wednesday at noon, the tornado siren blows when it's in clear weather, and that's what was going to happen here. All these noises were going to go off, and at that point in time, everyone was supposed to bow down and worship this image wherever this image was. Could everyone be there where that image was? Well, no, they couldn't. Could everyone know about this because all these government officials got the word out? Yes, they could. And so they're here to witness to all the Babylonian people this great image. What are they going to be able, at the end, being able to witness in actuality? The power of God? Yeah. You know, what are they going to see that's a lot more important than that huge gold image? And they're going to see God taking care of His people. Let's look at verses 8 through 13. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke to King Nebuchadnezzar and they said, "O king, live forever." If we go back to chapter 2, what do we remember about Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego regarding the results of interpreting the dream for King Nebuchadnezzar? What happened to them? What did Nebuchadnezzar do for Daniel after he interpreted that dream? I heard stuff behind masks. If you said he gave him a promotion, basically, all right, then you did the right thing. He got a position out of it. He was of increased influence. He was given some governmental authority. He was put in charge of several different things. And Scripture at the end of chapter 2 talks about he also did or brought Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with him. So think about what he's done there with bringing them in on his coattails in order to be in charge of some things, and who he's displaced. What did Nebuchadnezzar do when he first wanted to know the image? He called his magicians, right? The Chaldeans and all those other people that were listed, and said, "Do this," and they couldn't do it. Daniel did do it. Daniel got the promotion. So did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now who's upset in chapter 3? So there's a little bit of jealousy going on here. They come into the king and they say, "O king, live forever." All right, and I think about that too because I want to contrast that later to how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego addressed King Nebuchadnezzar. It said, "O king, live forever." Verse 11. "And whoever does not fall down in worship shall be cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And there are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. O king, they have not paid their dues in regard to you." To you. "They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up." What's the key word there? Is it the gold image? Whose ego are we trying to deal with here? These guys are coming before Nebuchadnezzar and they are playing on his ego. This has nothing to do with the gold image. Do you think that they know that there is no authority in that gold image to go out and take care of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do you think that there is still a problem, however many years later that this is, with them having to serve under these captives? You know, can you imagine what it might have been like at the family picnic when they had to sit there and talk about being overlooked for the position that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had? Can you imagine those captives who are now in charge of this when that should have been my job to do? Well, They're going to get their just rewards now. You know, do you remember another story that's kind of similar to this one? I was thinking of Gideon. And that works too, Steve. Haman works too. But Gideon went out and trashed all the altars to Baal one night. And so all the Baal worshipers came to Joash, Gideon's father, the next day, and they said, hey, you need to get Gideon out here because we need to give him a whooping because he took down all those altars. And what did Joash say to them? Well, really? Well, why don't you let Baal come take care of Baal's business? You know? And that's what's happening here. These guys know that that image can't take care of business. You know? So they got to take matters in their own hands, and they're going to come talk to the king, and they're going to try to set up death for Daniel, or for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I have wondered, as I've looked at this, where Daniel is in this, and perhaps you have too. I don't know. I think the story serves us, though, to recognize that Daniel was not the only person who was in Babylon that was serving God. We expect Daniel to do the right thing. Certainly in chapter 6, we see that he did when it came to the lion's den issue. And as David pointed out last week, potentially he was in his 80s when that happened. And we have a story here about 3 of his companions who went through the same training that he did, the same indoctrination to be a Babylonian that Daniel did, and they also made a choice to serve God rather than serve Nebuchadnezzar. So certainly there is that there. Perhaps Daniel was away. I have a feeling that if Daniel had known, and you know that Daniel was not bowing down to the image either. And perhaps if Daniel had been there, he would have stepped in front of the king for his friends. Perhaps if he had done that, King Nebuchadnezzar might have relented because of Daniel's influence. You get where I'm going? We don't know why, but the story works because Daniel wasn't there. The story works because we see how God used Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why would Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not bow down before the image? What were their rules? Exodus chapter 20, Nicole mentioned it, the 10 Commandments. What do we have? What are the rules for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves a carved image or any likeness or anything that is in heaven above or the earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, your God, am a jealous God. You know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to make a choice. They had to think short-term or long-term. And we have not been in a situation that was exactly apples to what this is. Although there are things happening in our country that I wouldn't have dreamed would have happened 30 or 40 years ago. There are people in this world, in this day and age, who've had to make this decision. Do I serve God, or do I do what I'm told by our government? And in some respect, now during this particular emergency, we have to come to that same conclusion too. How do we serve God? How do we continue to serve God? It's complicated. It can get complicated. Whether we do it here, whether we do it at home because we offer things that allow that and so on and so forth. But we have to make those decisions. You know, and from an elder's perspective, we worry constantly that we're providing what we need to provide to be able to allow you to continue to serve God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew what their job was, and it was to serve God. In verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar went into a rage and a fury, and he gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before him. Later in the scripture, it's going to say that he was so mad that his face contorted. Have you ever seen someone that was that mad that their face took on a completely different look? The anger got into them, and maybe their eyes went crazy and lines appeared where there weren't lines before, and so on and so forth. We need to not underestimate how mad Nebuchadnezzar was. And we need to not underestimate how effectively those people that came before him played on his ego here. And yet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to do the wrong thing and continued to do the right thing. Third part of this chapter, the response, verses 14 through 18. I'm going to skip down to the last part of verse 15 because this is the part that I want us to sink in more so than anything else, because as we look at this entire chapter, I see verses 15, 16, 17, 18 as being the central part of it. It's the middle of the chapter, it's the middle of the argument, it's the middle of the discussion. It's the most important thing we got going with it. The last part of chapter 15, or verse 15 rather. This is Nebuchadnezzar speaking. I'm going to read this once and I'm going to hesitate because I really want this to sink in, because as he's in this rage, as his face is contorted, he looks at them and he says, "And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Don't you think that he needs to regret saying that? Who is the God that's going to deliver you from my hands? Well, who is that God? We know who that God is, and that God has got a lot more power than Nebuchadnezzar had, but look at the position Nebuchadnezzar puts himself. He believes that he is the most powerful entity, person on the face of the known planet at that point in time. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to look him straight in the face and say, "So what?" Go to verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar." Now, how did all the satraps earlier go in front of the king? "O king, live forever." Is that the way Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego address him? They show respect for him. They talk to him and say, "Oh, Nebuchadnezzar." But do they say, "Oh, King Nebuchadnezzar"? "Oh, sir." "Oh, judge," begging the court's pardon? They do not. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." We could stop right there and laugh for the rest of the day. Because what they told the king was, this is a need-to-know basis and you don't have the need to know. You know, we don't need to explain anything to you because you're not in charge. Do we have the nerve to be able to do that in the right situation? I think we do. But you know, how many of us have ever been tested to that degree? We don't know until we face it. But I believe we do. And I know that studying this lets us know that God's going to protect us, because that's the whole point of this particular story. Verse 17, "If this is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image that you have set up." Pretty powerful, isn't it? You know, they make it pretty clear that they're not going to do anything that has to do with worshiping this image. There is another lesson, I think, here, and it's a lesson of just get to the point, don't go too far, make your statement, sit down, shut up. Did they go to a great deal of effort here to make this statement? No. Hey, we're not going to do this. We're not going to serve your God. That's the end of that story. No rationalization, no trying to explain it to him, doing nothing else. Have we seen that before? Or did we see that again? Did we see that 600 years later with Jesus standing before the magistrates, before the high priest, before Herod, before Pilate? How did Jesus approach that? Look in Matthew chapter 26 and turn to verse 63. Matthew chapter 26, verse 63. Thank you for turning the pages, by the way. If you've got an electronic Bible, you're good too. I don't mean it that way. I shouldn't have said that, I guess. But pages turning, it's comforting, I guess. Matthew chapter 26, verse 63. But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, It is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And of course, then the rest of the story is the high priest tore his clothes. They went crazy. They shipped him back and forth between Herod and Pilate. And pretty much Jesus didn't really say anything else. There were a few remarks here and there. They were pretty brief. Here it is. No, I'm not. Yes, I am the Son of God. No, I'm not going to take part in all of this. Do what you have to do. It's pretty bold. Pretty bold. I hope we're all there. I think I am. I hope I don't have to really find out. Right? But when we're faced with persecution, how will we look at that? They stood in front of the king. The king had the power to kill them. Regardless of that, they chose to serve God. Let's look at the fourth part of the chapter, sentencing, verses 19 through 23. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. Pretty hot furnace, right? How did they know what 7 times hotter was? Does 7 times hotter kill you faster than just a normal furnace? What do you think the furnace was for, by the way? Have you thought about that? It probably was the garbage dump. It was the incinerator. You know, outside Jerusalem in the valley of Hinnom, there was a constant fire. It was a refuse dump, and it was a constant fire, and it was always being burned to get rid of the garbage. And from that, we get the word for everlasting, eternal hell of Gehenna. Probably this was the same thing. It was the incinerator to get rid of everything. Now, in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 22, this furnace has been used before for capital punishment. So it's not an unheard of thing. But it probably was just there to take care of getting rid of the garbage. You know, some of you are, if you're my age and as a kid you worked in a grocery store, did you have an incinerator in the back of that grocery store? You did, because what did we do in 1975? We burned all the cardboard. We didn't recycle it. You didn't put the word "re" in front of cycle in 1975. You only put the word motor in front of cycle or buy in front of cycle, that kind of stuff. But what happened if we went to the grocery store and we accidentally, this happened in the store that I was working in, someone accidentally shut the vents off to the incinerator, and it shut it down. And management was extremely upset because that incinerator is not the easiest thing in the world to get back up to that smoldering temperature where it constantly burns that stuff away. And so we have this device that we use to get rid of all the garbage, and it's there, and it's going to be a perfect thing because it's already lit. We're doing the things that we do. Let's get this thing 7 times hotter, and let's make sure that we can kill Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego even quicker than we would otherwise. Verse 20, and he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments. And this is another part that I find really funny, because if we're going to put them in a furnace that's 7 times hotter than normal, why do we need to bind them at all? Why do we need to make, are we worried about that they're going to get in there and get out of their bindings and walk back out? Well, in foreshadowing, he should have been worried about that, shouldn't he? Because that's exactly what they're going to do. But he bound them up in order to throw them in there. Verse 22, therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men fell down bound into the midst of that furnace. Nebuchadnezzar didn't have any respect for those soldiers that were working for him. Their lives were expendable, and he sent them to their death when they took care of trying to put Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into that fiery furnace. Now we get to the part in verses 24 through 27 that is the theme of this particular chapter. God protected Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why? Because they trusted him. Who was still there to watch all these events? All those government officials that had been charged earlier with going out and taking care of all these different notifications, they're all, I can imagine them. They go out, they do these things, they cluster back to the palace because everybody's trying to get close to the king. They always stay in pretty close proximity because who knows when something important might need to be done. And so they're still available. And what are they going to be able to testify to? In verses 24 through 27, then Nebuchadnezzar was astonished as he rose in haste, and he spoke, saying to his counselors, did we not cast these 3 men into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. And he answered, he said, look, there are 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Now, if you have a King James or a New King James, you have Son capitalized and you have God capitalized. That is not a good translation. Okay? If you have the New American Standard, what he's saying there is that they are walking, or the 4th man is walking around and he looks like the sons of a god. Whatever he recognized as something royal, something special, something different from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I know what I was taught in Vacation Bible School 100 years ago. I was actually taught that the 4th guy was Jesus. There is no evidence of that. And as a matter of fact, later in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar refers to that 4th person as an angel. So in one place, the sons of a god, in the next place, an angel. Our point is that God sent someone to protect Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you had been in that fire, would you have come out pretty quick? What are they doing in that fire? As if though nothing is happening, yes? Again, God's wisdom in having them not hit the fire and come out of the fire like they were shot out of a cannon, but walking around in the fire showing that they are not hurt. The message is being sent to everyone who's there that these men are protected by God. Nicole?
They should have even died when the 2 guys that were bringing them in, or whoever they were.
Yes, they should have. They should have been dead before they ever entered the furnace.
And everybody else should have
Yeah.
said, wait a minute, and they did that.
And when they walk out without the smell of smoke. How many of you have lived somewhere where you had a fireplace in your house? Does the house at one time or another smell like smoke? And you can't stop it. It doesn't matter how good that chimney draws. Sooner or later, you're going to get that air forced back down that chimney, and you're going to have a smoke smell in the house. And they came out of that, not a hair on their head was singed, their clothes were not damaged, and they didn't smell like smoke. What have these guys got to testify to now? You know, what can they tell the people now? Now, I don't have much time, and I want to get to the next part that I think is the second humorous part of all this, because when Nebuchadnezzar praises God, he doesn't praise, as Phil pointed out earlier, the one true God. He talks about their God. Look in verse, the latter part of verse 28. He's talking about that they should not serve or worship any god other than their own. Therefore, I will make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces. He can't help himself, can he? Nebuchadnezzar is still going to try to control this situation because as he says, look, this God is obviously a powerful God, but if you say anything bad about him, I'm still going to step in and I'm going to do his job and I'm going to cut you into small pieces. So I can't help but find humor in how Nebuchadnezzar approaches this, but I know that there's nothing humorous about it to God. Because once again, Nebuchadnezzar is just thumbing his nose at God and saying, you're not really in charge here. But it is comforting, and I don't want to lose the fact or lose the point, because in today's time, what do we want to see? We want to see a high government official recognizing that there is a God. Right? And Nebuchadnezzar did that. Now, he had to do it in his own style, and he went a little bit far in doing it. But he did do it in chapter 2. He did it in chapter 3. He's going to do it again in chapter 4. So I should look for the good part and talk about that. But the good part, you know, is it's still Nebuchadnezzar as he's looking at it. All right. So what's the morals of the story? I guess God is in charge. Certainly, if we allow God to be in charge, He will protect us one way or the other. I want to make sure I get through all my notes because I know I heard one bell, right? Make sure there's nothing else that I wanted to get to. Did I hear 2 bells? Just one? All right. So we've got Nebuchadnezzar. We've got... yeah. You guys you set me up, didn't you? What's the point? God is in charge. What's the secondary point? God protects those in one way or another. And our reward, or we will be protected, and our reward will happen, if not in this world, certainly in the next. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.